Hello, this is Mike and welcome to F2F Tech. Today we'll be adding the results of the HD 4890 and the GTS 250 to my Windows 10 DirectX 9 and 10 benchmark suite. Now I've already done videos on both of these cards, but to be completely honest, the videos kind of suck. Now when I put together this benchmark suite, I always wanted to update it with these cards, as they probably won't be getting any additional love for some time. Since these cards did get their own barely mediocre videos, I won't be going into the specs too much, but I'll go ahead and throw them up on the screen. The HD 4890 was the fastest single HD 4000 series GPU that ATI had ever released. It traded blows with the GTX 280 and the GTX 275, and it's one of my personal favorites from my ATI collection. Now the GTS 250 competed with the HD 4850, and it did a pretty good job. Now, while this was yet again another G92 based GPU, it was slightly different, much like the 9800 GTX Plus, as both were based on a 55nm process, and it was now called the G92B. Now at this time the GPU was an amazing little chip, but Nvidia slapped too many coats of paint on this thing and it was starting to chip, and most were glad to finally see it retired. Okay, so before we get into it, I wanted to mention the purpose of this video is to show current performance of each of these older GPUs using the newest compatible drivers and Windows 10. Now I do have some older titles in this game suite, but the majority of them are newish DirectX 10 games, so if you're wanting to see how these cards perform in only older titles using an older OS and a popular resolution from the time frame, then there are plenty of websites out there with that information. And who knows, maybe one day I'll take on that task. Now I did use the latest drivers for both of the cards, and the AMD Windows 10 compatible drivers install automatically through a Windows update. Now I did compare these drivers to the Windows 8 Catalyst Beta 13.4, and the results were pretty much the same. I did encounter some issues with the HD 4890 using Windows 10 in some of these games, so some of the results may surprise you, but we'll talk about that a bit more later on. Alright, well the first game up is everybody's favorite, GTA 5, and here we're using the normal settings at 1080p with no AA. Now the GTS averaged 37 frames per second, and overclock it rose 10% to 41. Now moving on to the HD 4890, we averaged 45 frames per second, and overclock that number rose 8% to 49. This was one of the games that we experienced some issues with the HD 4890. The main issue here was GPU usage fluctuated greatly, and this isn't something you see much of in Windows 7, so I'm chalking it up to Windows 10 and the drivers, as we should see a much larger performance gap. Frame times look good for the GTS 250, but we did see some stutter with the HD 4890. Next up is BioShock Infinite, and we're using the medium preset at 1080p. The GTS 250 averaged 34 frames per second, and overclock that average grew 11% to 38. Now moving on to the HD 4890, we see it pull 45 frames per second on average, and overclocked it jumped up 15% to 52, which is a very nice performance gain. Overall frame times were okay for both cards, with some stutters here and there. Still not a bad showing for both cards. Also, feel free to pause the video for the remainder of the benchmarks, as this is a lot of information to take in. And moving right along, we have an older must-play title, Stalker Call of Pripyat. And here we're using the high preset with DX10 enabled. The GTS 250 averaged 62 frames per second, and overclock we saw an 11% increase to 69. Now the HD 4890 saw an average of 76 frames per second, and it overclocked saw a 15% gain to 88. Again, another great result for both cards, but the 4890 dropped it into third and didn't look back. Now let's take a look at the 2013 version of Tomb Raider, and at 1080p using the high preset, the GTS 250 averaged 40 frames per second, and overclocked that number jumped up 10% to 44. Unfortunately, the 4890 only averaged 35 frames per second, and when it was overclocked it went up 17% to 41. Definitely a nice increase, and no issue with GPU usage, but the card kind of fell apart at high settings. It does alright at the normal preset, but this title plays a little too well with Nvidia cards. It's also worth mentioning frame times were tight on all the cards tested. Now let's take a look at Metro Last Light Redux, or Anyway, we're using the medium preset at 720p, and here the GTS 250 averaged 50 frames per second, overclocked that number rose 8% to 54. Now onto the 4890, it produced 72 frames per second, and overclocked that number rose 15% to 83. That's a great showing for the 4890. The GTS 250 did pretty well trading blows with the 8800 Ultra, but it didn't come anywhere close to the ATI card. As comparing stock clocks, the 4890 was 44% faster and 53% faster after comparing overclocks. And Hitman Absolution is up, and using the medium preset at 1080p, the GTS 250 averaged 35 frames per second, and with an overclock it jumped up 11% to 39. Now the 4890 averaged 41 frames per second, and overclocked it was a whopping nothing faster, as this is one of the games that GPU usage was low and all over the place, so overclocking yielded nothing in the way of performance, but frame times were slightly better. It's not a great showing for the 4890, but the GTS 250 held up pretty well. Total War ATTILA is the next game, and using the low preset at 720p, the GTS 250 averaged 26 frames per second. Overclocked, that average rose 7% to 28. As you can see, this game tends to favor ATI/AMD cards, so the 2900 XT is breathing some wildfire in it. Now, the 4890 averaged 51 frames per second, and overclocked it rose 19% to 61. That's a very nice increase in performance, and it's in another league compared to all the other cards tested. 3 games left, and the first of those 3 games is the OG system killer, Crysis. Now, we only tested using the medium settings at 1080p to give the little guys a fighting chance. Now, the GTS 250 averaged 55 frames per second, and overclocked it shot up 7% to 59. Oddly enough, the 4890 got curb stomped in this title by the G92B card. Again, I blame drivers and Windows 10 for this, and my results did check out. For example, I compared the standalone benchmark run with Tom's Hardware recent look back at Crysis using Windows 10, and my results were 2 FPS higher than their 4870, which checks out. And the second to last game is Sleeping Dogs, and using the medium preset at 1080p, the GTS 250 averaged 35 frames per second. Overclock it rose 8% to 38. Now the stock 4890 averaged 39 frames per second, and overclock that number rose 7% to 42. Good showing for the GTS 250, but not so much for the 4890. As you can see, frame times were pretty crap for the majority of the cards tested, as stutters frequently felt. Alright, if anybody's still here, the last game is Sniper Elite 3, and using the low preset at 1080p, the GTS 250 averaged 36 frames per second, and overclock it rose 8% to 39. Now moving on to the 4890, it averaged 53 frames per second, and with an overclock that number shot up 17% to 62. Now this game tends to favor ATI/AMD cards, so it's no surprise the 4890 is killing it here. Frame times were pretty good for the 4890, but not so much for the 250. Alright, so we just tested 10 games, and now it's time to take a look at the 10-game average. And here we can see the GTS 250 is 24% slower than the stock 4890. Now, when we compare overclock results, the 4890 maintains its lead by 27%. Now, these two cards sit at the top of the charts for now, but we will be adding the 4870X2, the 9800 GX2, and the GTX 280, 260, and other cards as well, so keep an eye out for that in the future. Now before we sign off, let's take a quick look at power consumption, and to load our test system we use The Witcher 2. And we can see the entire PC with the stock GTS 250 sips 186 watts under load. Now overclock, it rises 5% to 196 watts. It's pretty power efficient, all thanks to the 55nm G92B. Now moving on to the HD 4890, we can see under load the system uses 232 watts, and overclocked it rises 14% to 265. Now it looks a bit piggish sitting at the top of our charts, but we still have more power hungry cards to test. Also note these numbers are taken at the wall, so they do not account for PSU efficiency. Alright, well that wraps up our look at the GTS 250 and the HD 4890 in our DX9 DX10 test suite. Now I think performance-wise the GTS 250 held up great against its older G80 siblings, and it's even more impressive when looking at power consumption. Overclocked, it didn't see huge gains, but for such a small 10-watt jump, it's certainly worth doing. The 4890 was a bit of a mixed bag using Windows 10. In some games it performed as it should or better, and others it was kind of disappointing. Of course, in games that it did well in, performance after overclocking was certainly incredible. All in all, I think it's clear that driver-wise, NVIDIA does a better job at supporting cards from this time period in Windows 10. Regardless, it was still fun putting these beasts of yesteryear through the paces, and I do plan on adding more cards in the future, so get subscribed if you haven't, and plan on buying some bifocals as these charts won't be getting any bigger. Also, if you want to get pinned, then correctly guess the name of the game being shown. If you want to help support my work on the channel, then check out the description and give my affiliate links some love. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video.